when God has called us into faith, so many things have changed for us in life, and He has replaced so many things with familiar things. We use the same words for them, but they might have entirely different content. Like love has a new sense, a lot of new sense to it. Understanding or humility or many words. And not so much the words, but their content is what matters, and we're so grateful for this. And welcome this morning for the simple truth from the Word of God. So I just want to mention this simple truth that God has called us to a greater obedience when we became believers. All right. So I don't mean that God has called us to obey more or obey, better maybe, but not more rigid, definitely not more rigidly. That's not the point. And that's a great point to make, I think, because sometimes believers and even an entire denomination may make that mistake and believe that what God is expecting of us is a more rigid obedience, and that's a greater obedience. But God is really calling us to a greater obedience, but not in that sense. He's calling us to a greater obedience in the sense that He wants our obedience not to be out of fear, okay? So there is a fear, there is an obedience that comes out of fear. There's an obedience that comes primarily out of fear of punishment, fear of losing something, fear of the displeasure of someone, okay, who is important to us, and that is obedience out of fear, and actually that kind of obedience is sort of notorious for producing lousy results. The Apostle Paul alludes to this in Philippians 2 when he commends the Philippians and says, I'm so happy that you're obedient in my absence also. You're not just obedient in my presence, because obedience primarily out of fear would be an obedience that produces just superficial, lame, sort of very short-sighted results, okay, not very, very powerful, deep-rooted results. It produces results that last only until the boss leaves the room, and then everybody goes back to, I don't know, sipping margaritas, and nobody does anything until he shows up again. That's obedience out of fear primarily. But our relationship with the Lord, and the word fear can be applied here. Of course, I'm not trying to say that that's not there, but that's an entirely different story, because God has called us to a different kind of fear also. But I'm not going to go into that now. But this obedience is out of gratefulness. The one that He calls us to, the greater obedience, is out of gratefulness, because we know we have received so much. We in Ephesians 1:6 we have been accepted in the Beloved. And why would I not be grateful for that? I have been adopted into God's family. Wow, I am so grateful for that. And that means, because I am grateful for Him, grateful to Him for that, I love to obey Him. I don't have a problem. Now, is that a more rigid obedience? Well, I definitely obey God more than I did before I became a believer, because then I obeyed Him none. I was not even interested in the whole thing. But that's not the point of it. God is not saying your Christian growth means obey more rigidly and more and more and more rigidly. That's not the point. No, He says learn to obey out of love. Let me just read 1 Peter 1:22. Seeing that you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit unto unfeigned love of the brethren, see that you love one another with a pure heart fervently. There's so much in that verse, but I just want to focus on the simple truth that this obedience is connected with love, because it is something that is coming out of gratefulness. Like, we have received God's love and we're grateful for it, and therefore I want to obey Him because I'm so grateful. And that's a totally different story. It is not trying to obey the rules to please. The enemies of Christianity often pretend that my walk as a believer and your walk as a believer is we're simply doing it because we're afraid of the punishment of hell. Well, our obedience is not primarily motivated by fear. It is motivated by mainly by receiving God's love and being grateful for that. It springs from the fact that we know we are accepted. And that's a beautiful kind of obedience. That's a greater obedience. Hey, have an awesome day in the Lord.